Hello and welcome to another session on methodology of literature. Last class we did start with the Middle English period. I did tell you that Middle English period cannot be constructed into a single continuum or single seamless continuum. It has to be divided into two. First part before the age of Chaucer and the second after the age of Chaucer. We also discussed how Middle English becomes an in-between language. Some historians, some scholars calls it an in-between language. The reason why it is an in-between language is because it started during the Middle Ages. English started losing its Germanic influences and its inflections and started taking shape of what we can comprehend as English. But again, it was different. It was not the kind of English that we have today. It was an in-between. It was neither something strange like the Old English, nor something very easy to understand as the modern English. It is an in-between language or an in-between period. We also discussed a few characteristics of the Middle English period. We also discussed Magna Carta, which is a politically defining moment for England, basically because it started or it gave rights to the Englishmen. Well, it was for the barons, of course, but again, the Englishmen started having their rights. Later, we also, I also did tell you about the statute of pleading, whereby all the official proceedings of the court should be in English, and therefore English was slowly taking shape of being an official language. Now let us, before we move on to the language section, as we always do, the same method, we'll just first look at the historical background of the Middle English period, the various kings, the Norman kings during the Middle English period, because it is very important as a literature student, because these characters also forms the theme of various literary works. For instance, you have Henry IV in Shakespeare's plays. You have Thomas Becket, St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury Tales written by Chaucer, and also in Tennyson's Becket, and also in T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral. So, and you also have Robin Hood stories, which is concentrated on Richard the First, the Norman king. So, therefore, it is important that you have to understand some of the historical histories of England, or rather to say the various kings of the period, so to understand literature better. So without much ado, let's get started. The Middle English period. Middle English period spans from 1066 to 1485, between the time when King William the Conqueror becomes the ruler of England, and 1485, it ends in 1485 when Henry Richmond defeats Richard III at Bosworth Field and takes over the rule of England as Henry VII, thus beginning the Tudor dynasty. Now let's have a quick look at the main kings. Before we have a quick look at the main kings, I want you to look at the slide to just to have a quick look at the milestones of the Middle English period. Now here are the milestones of the Middle English period. 1066, you have the Norman conquest. 1215, the Magna Carta was signed. It was a very important period, a politically defining period. And 1250, French starts losing its prominence due to several socio-political events. 1337 and 1453, between 1337 and 1453 marks the 100 Years' War, and 1362 again, a very important year, the Statute of Pleading, which ordered that henceforth all proceedings in law courts should be in English instead of French. And this year was also characterized by the bubonic plague. Now, the main kings during the Middle English period. First, let's start with William I himself. William, who was William the Conqueror. When he became the King of England, he becomes William I. He was a Norman king. Now, this William, he was from a province called Normandy in France, in France. It is believed that he always had an eye for England. He always believed that England is his birthright. See, these people were all connected. Another thing that you have to remember, because very soon we will be starting Renaissance. So before we start Renaissance, you have to understand that the Europeans, they felt that this continent, the Europe, and these people there, they believed that Europe was the only place with life in this planet, and there isn't any, or there aren't any life or civilization beyond it. So this is, or they had taken things for granted. They had had several beliefs, and therefore they didn't know that there was a world beyond. So this is very important before we move on to Renaissance. An understanding is very important. So here also he felt that, see, what I was trying to tell you is, William believed that this England was his birthright, and he wanted to conquer this place. He was waiting for a chance, in fact, to conquer England. And after the death of Edward the Confessor, we have Harold as the king, remember. So Harold was a weak king. People did not like him. People were in fact very agitated and very angry with Harold because he was a very weak king, and obviously people always wanted to be under a powerful and protective king. Like Alfred the Great, they already had great kings. The Anglo-Saxons, they already had great kings during their period. They knew great kings. So Harold being a very weak king, they did not like him. So when William came, he was waiting for a chance to invade England, and when he found that Harold was the one who was in power, he came, he invaded, he conquered. And when he conquered, in fact, the people were very happy with this man. It is very strange that when William comes and conquers the place, the people in England, they started cheering him. They were welcoming him. But there was a confusion in the French dialect and the English dialect. There was a confusion between French and English dialect, and therefore William thought that the people were getting angry and they were agitating or revolting against the conquest. What happened was William burnt, and his soldiers burnt, the whole city of London because of this misunderstanding. And this misunderstanding in fact went on for quite some time. And there is a it is out of curiosity, okay, there is a long and beautiful tapestry called the Bayeux tapestry, which is around 70 meters long, and it is hand embroidered, and it depicts the events of the battle, between William and Harold, and is still preserved in the museum in Normandy even today. Now I want you to take a quick look at this tapestry which is preserved in Normandy. Now William, he ruled from 1066 up to 1087, and there are certain other things that we ought to know about William as literature students. I presume you have heard of the word doom, which today has the form or the meaning of destruction. But doom actually means judgment, like you have in Christianity, where Christ will come towards the end, or when the world ends, and there will be this final judgment. So likewise, this word doomsday was used by William he commissioned what is called the Doomsday Book. Now this you have studied, or this comes as a reference in several other plays as well as poems as well. I presume you must have studied Constable Calls by Seamus Heaney, where the child gets scared when his father is interrogated of the survey, when the constable comes to take a survey of the crops that he has cultivated there. So there they speak of the Doomsday Book. Okay, so here he commissioned this book, and this is an elaborate survey of the English resources, including land, livestock, and it recorded even the number of chicken that a person had. So it was an elaborate survey and a very important historical document. It is preserved, it is available for reference even today. It is, if you want, you can just have a look. You can just go Google and search opendoomsday.org, and you can view it page by page. It's a very important historical document. Now the idea behind this Doomsday Book was to tax the country as much as possible based on the information he got from the Doomsday Book. Now I did tell you of the meaning of Doomsday. Doomsday means judgment. So he used this word to mean that just like the final judgment, when the world ends, the judgment is final. Just like that, everything, the taxation, whatever a person has to pay, will be based on the records or on the information recorded in that book, and he has to pay accordingly, and there is no change in it. Okay, so that is the Doomsday Book. All right. Now, another thing about William the First was that he was a paranoid king. Though he was a strong person, a powerful man, he was also a paranoid, and being a foreigner, he was scared that he would be not welcomed by the people. I did tell you of in the beginning that when he came, or when he conquered this place, the people were actually welcoming him, but then due to the confusion in the dialect between French dialect and English dialect, he thought that they were revolting against him. And being a paranoid, what he did was he and his soldiers burnt down the whole city of London. So he was always scared of his safety. He always wanted to keep his throne secure, and in order to keep his throne secure, what he did, he decided to construct a secure fort. He had many forts but he wanted a very safe and a secure fort, and he orders the building of a very secure concrete fort, and that is the Tower of London next to the river, next to the river Thames. Now today, this tower is a complex of many fortified buildings. There are many buildings built one after the other after many centuries by many kings who ruled this place or ruled England. Now, out of curiosity again, let me tell you that this Tower of London is considered as the most secure place in the world. Even the Kohinoor diamond is preserved here, it seems. Not just that, this was also a royal residence for some time. It was a zoo for some time. It was a prison for some time, and a treasury for some time. The royal jewels are kept or preserved here. And also it was a prison. There were many great or important famous prisoners were held, like you have Queen Mary, also referred to as Bloody Mary by the English people, because it was during her time that there was a lot of bloodshed, and also she was beheaded, or she was kept here in this Tower of London. Then you have Mary, Queen of Scots, mother to James the First of England, and Henry's wives were all beheaded here. So there were many others also, many famous people who were the prisoners here. You can still see the torture apparatus or appliances that were held or that were used still kept there. Anyway, that is the Tower of London. Just take a quick look at the slide to understand how secure this fort is. Now, another impact of the Norman conquest was that the church, the people who held the offices of the church, they were the clergy, they were all replaced. They were earlier, they were the Anglo-Saxons, they were all replaced now by the French people. Many Englishmen, noble Englishmen were or noblemen were killed. Many became subservient to the rulers. The new ruling class became the French. Now, people, some of them were forced to support the new king because out of fear of their own lives. Some for various favors that they would gain. So they had no other go other than to support the new king. And what happened was the language of these people, that is the aristocrats, became French, and English was reduced to the language of the common man. We did discuss all this in the last few videos about power and language playing a very intimate relationship. Whoever is in power, that language becomes powerful. So here the Normans came, they conquered, French was their language, and therefore French becomes the official language. Earlier the Anglo-Saxons came, they conquered, and therefore English became the official language. Before that was the Celtic language, or the Gaelic and the Celtic languages, because they were in power. So likewise, as the rulers, whoever rules, that language becomes more powerful. So French here started to become the official language of the upper class and the ruling class, and English was reduced to that of the language of the peasants or the common man. But you must understand that there was a lot of changes taking place in our language also, English language as such. A lot of changes was taking place. It was beginning to evolve into a beautiful language. So this Middle English period, or the medieval period, was a period of a lot of changes in England. Now the scribes, now if you look at our spellings also, the English spellings, there is a lot of French spellings in it. It happened because the French scribes wrote in English, or who wrote English brought in French spellings to English as well. So we have in English, we have a merge of the French words or French letters or French spellings also, not words or letters, French spellings also, because French, German, English, all these European languages are basically, you have the letters, the Latin letters are the ones which we use in these languages. But yeah, I'm speaking about the French spellings. The French spellings, because the French scribes wrote it, they used, or they brought in French spellings to English as well. Another king that you have to remember as a literature student is Henry II. Henry, who came some generations after, many years after William I, and his reign was between 1154 to 1189, and this event, or his reign, marked a very fateful event. A cruel murder took place during his period, and that was the murder of St. Thomas Becket. Now St. Thomas, who later became St. Thomas, Thomas Becket, who later became St. Thomas. Thomas Becket was the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was also a very close friend of Henry II. Henry made him the Archbishop of Canterbury, hoping Henry was a very shrewd fellow. He was a diplomat. He was very diplomatic. So in order to keep his power secure and also to have a control over the church, he made Thomas Becket the Archbishop of Canterbury. But what happened is that when Thomas became the Archbishop of Canterbury, he became independent. He refused to be controlled by Henry, and this led to an estrangement, or Henry got angry with Thomas, and he wanted to murder or kill Thomas, but he knew that would be a very risky one, because if people ever come to know of it, then that would affect his throne as well. He would be dethroned, or people will start revolting against him. So he was very clever, and he got few knights, 4 knights and a monk, to secretly get into his chamber, whose chamber, Thomas Becket's chamber, and had him murdered there. It was a cruel murder, and after the murder, these 4 knights and the monk, they hid in a castle in Northumbria, it seems. Anyway, people started smelling something. They knew there was some, there was something fishy about this murder, and they all suspected, they began to suspect our Henry, the Henry II. So, as I told you, this is very important because as literature students, because many works in English literature are based on this theme. You have Canterbury Tales, where the pilgrims go to visit the shrine of St. Thomas Becket. You have Tennyson's Becket. You have Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral, and so on. Many stories, many literary works of English literature are based on is based on this theme. So this is an important event in terms of literary or English literature as such. Now the story goes that Henry, when he understood that the people are not stupids, I told you, he was very shrewd. So he again made a diplomatic turn, and he made people think that he was he felt really guilty of what he did, and he, in order to atone the murder of his friend, he had himself flogged in public. Okay, this was actually a very diplomatic move, okay, from Henry II's part, because he wanted to keep his throne secure. He was not feeling guilty of what he did. It was just to keep his throne secure that he acted in, that he was very guilty of what he did, and he was trying to atone for what the murder of his friend. So he narrowly escaped the wrath of the Pope as well as the people, and people had him, or people forgave him, and he ruled England for many years. So that's one ruler that you have to understand being a literature student. You can take a look at this slide and you will understand. Next ruler is Henry II's son, Richard I. Now, when Richard became the king of England, people were very happy because he was a very powerful ruler. But again, Richard, though he is known in history, he is known as Richard the Lionheart. He was a valiant person, very brave, very strong. However, he was more into romantic gallantry. He was more into romantic battles than ruling his country. Soon after becoming the King of England, he went to fight the next crusade, the Third Crusade. I told you there were many foolish things that the Christians did, trying to spread Christianity. They had this crusades and all. A religion which spoke of peace tries to evoke violence, and this really did. It stopped, okay, it didn't move on, just stopped because it had reverse effect. People started questioning the church, and they also understood the corruption within the church, and so people started revolting against it. Christ never spoke of violence. Christ only spoke about peace. And anyway, Richard, he was a very he did a stupid, or he did a foolish act by going into these crusades. He was fighting, or he tried to fight Saladin, the Middle East ruler, to retake Jerusalem, but he did not win. It was a foolish attempt, and he came back. He lost the battle and he came back. Anyway, in literature, Richard I is known as a mysterious knight. You have him, or he is probably the one who is being spoken about in Robin Hood stories. He is also the heroic knight who comes to the rescue in Walter Scott's Ivanhoe and Talisman. When Richard was fighting, his youngest brother John, he managed the state. Now, Richard was killed in one of his adventures in Europe, and interestingly, again out of curiosity, his body is buried in 3 parts or 3 places of England. 3 places of France. His heart is buried in one part of France, his entrails in another part of France, and the rest of his body in yet another part of France. So he is buried in 3 different parts of France. Well, he was indeed an interesting character, a very gallant, very romantic hero. Though he is not known as a great king, he was, in fact, he's almost a legend. And I would like you to take a look at the slide. Next ruler is Henry II's son, Richard I. He became the king of England. Richard I is known in history. Now, once Richard was killed, his brother John was, people called him by a nickname. He was called John Lackland. He was ridiculed, or he was criticized by people, and he was called John Lackland because John did not have any right to inheriting the throne. He was the youngest brother, and he was just managing the state for when his brother was away. His brother was always into romantic battles, so he was the one who managed the state, and people called him John Lackland. But now John is no longer a Lackland. He is not Lackland. In fact, he is the ruler of England. He becomes the ruler of England, and King John is in fact one of the most unpopular kings in England, and he was the one who was forced to sign the Magna Carta. I want you to look at the slide. John, who was nicknamed John Lackland because people nicknamed him so because he managed the state without any right of inheritance when Richard was. So when King John became the king, I also told you that he was a very unpopular king. He had to, he maybe because people criticized him, maybe because he was always considered secondary, he tried to rule according to his whims and fancies, and there was a revolt also between him and the barons, and that is the very reason why he had to sign the Magna Carta. Now, he was not, if you saw the slide, you would have seen King John's face. King John was not happy to sign the Magna Carta. Magna Carta was drafted by the Archbishop, and he was forced to sign the Magna Carta, which was later on by various other kings. It was updated, kept on being updated for many years. This you can also find the Magna Carta. It is still preserved in London, British Library in London. You can see the seal, King John's seal there, and there are only 4 copies, it seems, and our 2 copies are kept in the British Library in London. So it was indeed historically and politically very significant, important, even linguistically. Okay, and this Magna Carta kept on being renewed. Now there were also other kings we ought to remember from literary point of view, and that is, let's start from Edward II. Edward II ruled, and he is one of the characters or the protagonists of Christopher Marlowe's plays, and he's best known for his love for his friend Gaveston. And then comes Edward III. Edward III, you find Edward III, who again comes towards the end of Marlowe's play, who after the death of his father Edward II, who was actually killed or murdered, he takes over the throne at a very young age, Edward III. And after Edward III, we have his son, but his son, who is better known as Black Prince, he was not able to take the throne because he died before Edward III. So Edward III's son could not rule. Instead, it's his grandson Richard II who ruled. That is Edward III's son's son, which is the Black Prince's son, Richard II, who ruled. That is Edward III's grandson, Richard II, who ruled. And you must also note that Chaucer lived during this period between of Edward III and Richard II. Now Richard II was not a very efficient king, and it was during his time that we have the peasant revolt of 1381, and he is also, Richard II is also one of Shakespeare's historical plays. And then comes Henry IV. See, Henry IV never had, he was not in line to the throne. He was a cousin to Richard. He was Henry Bolingbroke, and he was Richard's cousin, who had Richard imprisoned and had him killed in the prison. Richard was murdered by Henry IV in the prison. Now you also have Henry IV comes again as a character in Shakespeare's plays, Henry IV Part 1 and Part 2. So in the first part you have Henry IV, and later towards the end of the second part you have Prince Hall, the son of Henry IV, taking over the throne as Henry V. Okay, both in the play as well as in history. So Prince Hall, who is better known, who is actually Henry V, becomes the king after or succeeds Henry IV. Then Henry V dies at a very young age. He dies at the age of 35, and you have Henry VI taking over the throne, and he, however, was a very infirm and very unreliable king. He was also very weak during his reign, and it was since he was very unreliable and very weak, a lot of political disturbances happened during his reign. We have the War of Roses, which began to brew in England. It was also a time when they were fighting with France as well. Then there were a lot of people in between Henry the Sixth and Richard III. So many people, so many other kings came and went, and finally we come to Richard III. So we finally come to Earl of Gloucester, or Richard III. Now Richard III is the last person or the last ruler of the or rather to say of the Norman conquest. And after this we find the beginning of Tudor dynasty. So Richard III, who was the Earl of Gloucester, he was called, remembered as, or he's known as Richard Crookback, because he had a problem. He had a hunchback, or he was hunched back, and he couldn't walk steadily. He was a good fighter on horse, but he couldn't walk steadily. He was a villainous character, and he was not in fact in the line, exactly in line to the throne. He grabbed the crown of England, but he couldn't rule for long. There was a lot of unrest in the country during these times, and the Normans were becoming very unpopular too. And the War of the Roses continued. It went on from 1455 to 1487. Up to 1487 you have the War of the Roses. Now, War of the Roses, it is a battle within the kingdom. It is the battle between the two families of London, two families of England, between the families of Lancaster and York, and each had a symbol, each having a rose as a symbol, and this war went on for quite some time. You have the red rose for the House of Lancaster, and the white one represented the House of York. Anyway, coming back to Richard the Third, I did tell you that he was hunched back, or he was crook-backed, and his final battle would be the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. What happened was he fell from the horse and is killed by Henry Richmond. Now you have the same scene, or you have it depicted in Shakespeare's Richard III. The famous scene is depicted in Shakespeare's Richard III, where Richard III falls from his horse and he screams, "A horse, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," and nobody gives him a horse. Instead, people cut him down and he was killed, and somebody screams, "The bloody dog is dead." And that is the gruesome end of Richard III, and also the end of the Middle Ages in England in a symbolic manner, because after Richard III is killed in the battlefield, the new king is Henry Richmond, who becomes Henry VII of England, and he unites the two houses, the Lancaster and the York, and people elect him as the next king. Thus, he is the first Tudor monarch, and for the sake of convenience, around this time we say he ruled up to 1500, from 1487 to 1500, and when Henry VII had ruled for a long time, long period of time, the Middle Ages ends, and it is the beginning of the modern age. Next, in the next video, we shall begin with the Renaissance period and the Elizabethan literature. So until then, keep safe. Thank you.